Welcome back, everyone. So this is our third session on Dada, and we're going to focus on one figure and one figure alone, and that's Marcel Duchamp, who's gone down as, at least in Western art, one of the most, if not the most important artists of the 20th century. So originally I had assigned two chapters for this, or 1.5 chapters really, the 1914 and the 1918. So the 1914, you'll remember, hopefully, that half of it is about Tatlin, and you would have read that part for constructivism, and then the other part is about Duchamp. Then 1918 is all about Duchamp. But we're getting to basically the half of the summer here, and so I wanted to give you something of a break, a little bit of leeway. You're starting to think about your final projects, hopefully. So I thought, let's only talk about the material in 1914 and the really early Duchamp. And that'll be enough for this session. If you are interested in Duchamp, and especially if you're studying art history or in a humanities discipline, go ahead and read 1918 because it's important, especially for the discussion of the large glass, which is one of Duchamp's more important works. But for now, for the purposes of this class, let's only talk about the early Duchamp. The other thing I should say is that I've read a lot about Duchamp for my own work. And so I purposely didn't really prepare for this session because this is something that almost every professor does. It's hard not to do. If you've done a lot of work on whatever you're teaching, you tend to go too long. you tend to go overboard, mainly because you like it so much, right? So I purposely didn't really prepare for this one, not like the others, or some of the others. And so it'll be just hopefully a little bit more flowy, and I won't end up going too long, and hopefully it'll be more enjoyable, at least for our purposes. So without further ado, Duchamp, Marcel Duchamp. And this is a continuation of Dada. So we started with Zurich and Berlin. Now we go to New York. So a number of artists left Europe, escaped Europe because of the war, and ended up in New York. And New York, before U.S. entered into World War I, was not really part of it, right? It wasn't part of that World War. And so the concerns for these artists were somewhat different from the immediate concerns of those in Zurich or Cologne or Paris or Berlin, where a war is happening or a war just ended and the conditions of everyday life are completely different, right? Duchamp and a few other artists, notably Picabia, who's also a French artist, French Dadaist. I'll show you one example of his in this lecture, in this session. They were less interested, or they're away from the war, so it has less. It feels like it's less politically urgent, at least directly politically urgent, about the military and that sort of thing. And it'll be the energies of New York Dada have more to do with slightly more insular questions about art and art history. But it will still be Dada, so it's going to be almost like a full-on assault on art and art history, and especially those conventional, traditional, bourgeois values of art. And so I think you can already tell the title slide I've used here is a famous work that we're going to look at here with the Mona Lisa, who's been given a goatee and a mustache, right? So there's the irreverent, the mocking, the satirical, the cheeky, in some cases it is actually still pretty funny. All these parts of Dada remain in New York, but it'll feel less about politics and the war, and it'll be more about social, aesthetic questions, right? I think that's fair to say. And it's also more preoccupied with the question of the machine age. And we're going to have a whole separate section, I actually think it's the next one, the one after Surrealism, where we talk about the machine aesthetic, how that influenced artists beginning in the 1920s. Already Duchamp is interested in the question of what machines and new technologies, not just like Hannah Hawk and the Berlin Dada, not just the photo and this new information world and landscape, but the mechanization of society as a whole, and the way in which machines are affecting not only art but but society as a whole. So this is the question that's important for us today, because there's some that argue that we're going to be entering into a totally new age, a third technological revolution, one based on AI, right? And so the idea, especially the more dystopian ideas, are that pretty soon it's AI who's going to be teaching you art history, and not a human being. And it's AI that's going to be doing all these jobs everywhere. But let's not go down that path too long. So, Dada, Duchamp. So, normally when we talk about Duchamp, it often starts in 1913 with the Armory Show, which still happens every year in the Armory, and this is the first one. And here you're seeing an installation shot of the Armory. So, a lot of nice traditional statues and so on and so forth. It was really the first display of the pretty cutting-edge avant-garde art coming out of Europe. So, Cubism and not so much Futurism, but a lot of the more cutting-edge avant-garde movements. European painters and sculptors like Brancusi and other people that actually we won't end up studying. So it's important for the U.S. scene, and we haven't really talked about U.S. North American artists so much in this class. But in the early 20th century, most U.S. artists, especially painters, were working in styles that are safely still in the 19th century, right? So if you have an unfavorable reading of the history of U.S. painting, and this is not, I think we can argue against this, but some have an unfavorable opinion of U.S. painting, that it didn't really come into its own. It didn't have anything new to contribute until abstract expressionism, until the 40s, and especially the 50s. And one way to corroborate this is to look at the work in the early 20th century and say, okay, yeah, there's Robert Henry, very important teacher, very important painter at the time, but he's painting in a very realist sort of style that seems mid-19th century. And then you have someone like Maurice Prendergast, who's working in, I think your eyes will be able to tell you what style he's working in, a quasi-impressionist, post-impressionist, maybe kind of slightly pointillist style. And this is in 1918, 23, right? So there's this idea that U.S. artists had this long delay, and that the mantle of avant-gardism, of the cutting-edge styles, were in Europe. Whether or not that's fair is a question we could ask. Duchamp comes in all this because in the Armory Show he exhibits and submits this work called Nude Descending a Staircase, and it's he starts out as a painter, not the most gifted painter in the world, and he starts out as a cubist, but quickly he's kind of thrown out of the group of these cubists in France. One of them was actually his brother, so that's kind of rough. But he was kicked out of the group mainly because he couldn't stick to the rules of Cubism. And I think you're seeing that here a little bit. At first, you would say, okay, yeah, this looks like analytic Cubism, right? This looks like something coming out of what was happening in 1909, 1910. A little bit 1911 with Braque and Picasso. But then you also notice way too much movement and this kinetic quality, which then makes you think, okay, no, actually there's a bit of futurism here, right? So some have called this work like a cubo-futurist work. There's also a question of tone here. One thing you're going to find from this session, I hope, a big takeaway, is that Duchamp was funny. Like, Duchamp was into word puns. He was into humor. He was like a lot of artists. He was into sex. He was into sexual puns and so on and so forth. And here I can make just a little side note because it's important to historicize sexuality. It's important to historicize sex. So in the early part of the 19th century, sex in some ways is still kind of a taboo thing, right? Maybe not taboo, but it's not spoken of as frankly as it is today. Today, I mean, I probably don't have to tell you that sex is all over the place in advertising, online. There's barely a taboo anymore about sex. At least, let's say, we're talking about this country. So it's a very different time. Today, to be subversive, you might actually be prudish again somehow, right? There are some that argue that the way we live today, the media, the economy, it's set up where it's almost telling us you got to enjoy, like buy, enjoy, have fun, have sex, so on and so forth, right? It's almost as if society is set up where the subject is the subject that has to enjoy constantly, whether it's food, whether it's self-image, whether it's sex, whatever it might be, right? In the early 20th century, that's not at all what the world is like, right? So when we historicize this, we realize that if a painter like Duchamp is in some ways referencing sexuality, it's not just some cheap thing. Maybe there is something, in fact, subversive and taboo breaking about it, right? So that's just a little parenthetical that'll apply to a lot of the artists that we talk about. Okay, so back to the humor. This is called Nude Descending a Staircase, but of course, you can't. I mean, you can barely make out a figure, right? You see maybe a female figure, one that's very machinic, right? Duchamp is like I was saying before, he's interested in this new machine age. It's this robotic, cyborg-like figure that's going down the stairs. And Duchamp is being really cheeky here, because normally if you have a painting, especially a painting submitted in an exhibition like this, and there's nude in the title, you usually expect to see like a female nude, a mythological figure or whatever it might be, right? That's completely thwarted here because you just have this blur, and it's more robotic than anything. You barely get a sense of skin or sensuousness or eroticism, right? So there's also a bit of humor and of sending up of our art historical expectations, even in 1919. And so this created an uproar. It's hard to think that a painting could actually create a national uproar, but this one did. Some people called it an explosion in a tile factory. A lot of people were really taken aback by this painting, and the show traveled. Duchamp got a lot of notoriety through this one painting. This is Picabia, who also, I really love this painting. It's called I See Again in Memory, My Dear Udny, from 1914. And like Duchamp, Picabia was marrying, abstract kind of cubist work, but a cubism that's fused with technology, that's fused with luminescent electricity, and this new machine age. MoMA a few years back, not 2 years ago now, they had a big show at Picabia, and his paintings are really, really quite amazing. You get the sense of this machine that's lit up, that's moving, that's slightly biomorphic. Like parts of it look like it's these are organic shapes, and part are kind of clearly more technological tubes, metal, and so on and so forth. So this is almost like this cyborg shape, this cyborg abstract painting. And it's not at all clear as to what it's doing. It's this machine, half biomorphic shape that you really don't know what it's for, right? So Picabia was also interested in this kind of aesthetic. Which brings me to a really famous painting by Duchamp, where he was in a show, an aviation show of 1919. This was in Paris. He goes back and forth. After the war, he goes back to Paris, and then actually Duchamp traveled all over the place. He was pretty itinerant. But he has a very famous show. He's with Brancusi, who's one of the more famous modernist sculptors of the early 20th century. And they're in this exhibition, which is basically showing all the new technologies, all the new planes and everything in 1919. And he turns to Brancusi, supposedly, and he says, "Painting is washed up. Who will ever do anything better than that propeller? Tell me, can you do that?" So there's this really wonderful sense in this quote where he's basically saying that the new age that they find themselves in, where industry and technology seems to be way more powerful than traditional media. It seems to be in somehow way more potent and aesthetically interesting than anything a painter could do anymore. And so very famously, Duchamp gives up painting. At some point, he actually says he gives up art altogether. And he says, "I'm just going to become a chess player." And he does, in fact, become a chess player. And he becomes a really good chess player for the rest of his life. He's secretly still making work. This is one of the interesting things about Duchamp's career. He says he's retired as an artist, but he continues making works in secret, pretending to be, studying to be this great chess master. And so Duchamp is, with this quote, he's both fetishizing and lionizing technology as a new thing that's better than traditional media, and also saying that painting is over, and he will give up painting. He doesn't give up being an artist, but he gives up painting, which gets us to his most important contribution to 20th century art, which is the ready-made. So ready-made is now a term that's synonymous with Duchamp, and it's been incredibly influential, and here not only for Western art, but also for global art. So the idea of the ready-made is something that would have been received in Asia, in Latin America, and avant-garde modernist movements in the early and mid-20th centuries. So Duchamp is really, really important. And this is now lost. There's a refabrication of it in MoMA, which if you visited MoMA, you would have probably seen it. But this is the first ready-made. It's a bicycle wheel that's been turned upside down and affixed to a stool. So by ready-made, Duchamp is simply saying that the objects that are now a work of art, he didn't make. He didn't fabricate them. They were made in a factory, so machine age, factories, assembly lines, standardization. Those are all important ideas that are encoded in the ready-made. So he went to a furniture store and bought a stool and then used it to make a work of art. So the object that's used is already made, is already made. This is an example of an assisted ready-made, where the objects that he's bought, a bicycle wheel and a stool, he's configured and put them together. So he's assisted them like he has done something, right? He fuses them together, but he didn't make either one of them, right? So already this feels like an instigation. I think your critical antennas are up, and you feel like, okay, Duchamp, if he's really important, there must be something to this ready-made strategy, right? So one of the ways in which to interpret the ready-made, which is quite interesting. So here's Duchamp. This is much later. He's older here. And here he's with a stool and bicycle wheel, the first ready-made of 1913. It takes, again, a mocking, cheeky, funny take on how art was understood to be, really for most of the history since the Renaissance. So the traditional notion of art is that it should provide an aesthetic experience that's autonomous. Autonomous is a tricky word. There are a number of different meanings of autonomy, of autonomous. In our context here, it suffices to just keep in mind, or just to say that if an object is autonomous, it doesn't have any use value. It can't be like a commodity. Like it can't be something that just has exchange value. So it can't be like, silver that's mined somewhere, or copper that's mined somewhere in Brazil, that then is sold on the market, right? Then it's no longer autonomous. It has some kind of value. It can be instrumentalized, or a hammer, right? or a piece of bread. The bread has use value, it's nourishing, you eat it. The hammer has use value because you can use it to make a stool or to put up a picture or whatever. The art, as it had been traditionally understood, the aesthetic experience, is something that should be outside of this world. It should be outside of that world of use value. It should be beautiful, or it should be sublime, or it should be intellectual, or you have some kind of contemplation. This is the 101 of Kantian aesthetics. Immanuel Kant, probably the most important German philosopher in history, who wrote a lot about art and aesthetics. And he said that what an aesthetic object is an object that doesn't have any purpose, that is autonomous, right? And that's usually how art had been thought all the way up into the early 20th century, that a painting is not something that you use. A painting something is that it gives you an aesthetic experience that's divorced from those everyday concerns of use value and exchange value. And so here Duchamp, you want to think of this first ready-made almost as a visual pun, because what he's done is he's kind of made fun of the history of this traditional history of the aesthetic, which again would be very much part of the bourgeois conception of art as disinterested, right? As autonomous, but art is never disinterested and autonomous, right? Even the money that's used to buy it may very well have come from a place in society or a part of the economy that's anything but autonomous or disinterested. But in any case, it's almost like he's hacked this system, this aesthetic system that's been in place since the Renaissance. Because think about it, he's taken two commodities, two things that have use value, a chair you sit on, a wheel you use to get around on a bike, and he's fused them together in a way that now you can't use their use value, right? It would be tricky to turn this upside down and try to ride it like a unicycle. That's not something you would probably try to do. And you certainly can't sit on it anymore because of the bicycle wheel, right? So you have two objects that are commodities that have use value and exchange value, but he's negated them. You can no longer use them, but on top of that, you can no longer exchange them. I mean, no one is going to buy this as a bicycle, and no one is going to buy this as a chair. But here's where the genius comes in of Duchamp. Someone will buy it as art. And if this were still alive, if this was still an object that was existent, but even the replicas, those are considered works of art, right? And so he's taken two things that normally are not considered works of art, negated their use value, which then, by the very definition of art as an autonomous object that doesn't have use value, it doesn't have exchange value, this then becomes a work of art. But of course, in 1913, no one would have agreed with that. People would have just been in an uproar. People would have thought, like, this guy's crazy, right? What is he doing? What he's doing is he's forcing you to reconsider the definition of art as simply this autonomous aesthetic experience. He's forcing you to question the very definition of art. And this is one of the key tactical foundations of the ready-made strategy that he devises. So it's both funny, it's humorous. He's in a way like hacking the very definition of bourgeois aesthetics, the beginning in the Renaissance. But it's also quite serious because he's asking questions about art that no one had really asked before. So these are some of the reasons why Duchamp is so important, and this is going to become even more apparent in the last example I give you. I do want to show you another example of an assisted ready-made. This is, of course, a ready-made, right? Because he didn't make this. This is, you know this image well, the Mona Lisa. By Leonardo da Vinci, which is in the Louvre. This is, of course, just a poster, a reproduction of it, which gets us back to the idea of the mechanical and the ready-made. But it's an assisted ready-made because he's altered it. He's given her a goatee and a mustache. And so he's making fun of the icon, the very icon of Western art history. Like, people love this work. People flock to it. If you ever visit the Louvre, you have a hard time seeing it because there are so many people around her. So he's sending up, he's making fun of art history and this, like, you know, this saintly picture of art history. But then he goes even further with more wordplay. At the bottom of the poster, he puts 5 different letters, LHOOQ. And that seems nonsensical at first, until you're a French-speaking person, and you're someone who can understand French. And the impulse you would have when you see letters like this, notice it's very crucial, they each have a dot. So this is telling you that this is not a word, but basically it's telling you that you want to enunciate each letter individually, right? And so if you're a French-speaking person, you would say LHOOQ. And if you knew what that meant, you would start laughing or you would blush, right? In English, LHOOQ doesn't mean anything. But if you speak French or understand French and you hear someone say LHOQ, that person has just said, in a transliteral way, she has a hot ass. Right? And so the great thing about this work, it's a send-up of art history, but it's also funny because you can imagine, I mean, I like to imagine someone in 1920, like very uppity, very conservative, who sees this work and is maybe already like taken aback and offended by the goatee and looks at the text, doesn't understand it, so tries to say it out loud or say it in their mind, and then they're forced to say something profane. They're forced to say, you know, she has a hot ass, which is the last thing most people would say about the Mona Lisa. Like, to sexualize the Mona Lisa is not an art historical move. And LHOQ is like a literal translation, but to say that in French, it's also there. You know, the less literal translation of that would be, I'm sorry, this is not. This is somewhat misogynistic. So this is what the poster is saying, but not what I think or not what I'm saying. But it would be like she's ready to go, right? If you get my drift, like she's good to go. This kind of bro speak. He's forcing the viewer to say this out loud. It can actually even get dirtier, the translation. You can even use the C word, which I certainly won't say. But Duchamp was very, very fond of funny and transgressive sexual puns and wordplay, and this is one of those classic instances of it. So there's a reason why Duchamp is spoken of as part of Dada, right? All of this is very scathing and risky and transgressive, especially of bourgeois culture. Okay, and now this is where we get to probably the most important work of Duchamp, and usually it's kind of considered to be the most important object of the 20th century, again in Western art. Which is what we're focusing on in this class. So in 1917 in New York, there's another exhibition that was very important. It was called the Society of Independent Artists. And you had a number of artists that came together, very well known U.S. artists. So like someone like George Bellows, Duchamp himself, he's there. Catherine Dreyer, she's a really important collector. William J. Glackens was a well-known artist. Prendergast and his brother are there. So you have all these, Joseph Stella, you have all these U.S. artists who become the directors of this Society of Independent Artists, and they decide to forgo the academic system of art in this country, where there's always a jury, there's always a gatekeeper, and there are prizes and so on and so forth, right? Where you have to enter into a salon or an exhibition, and it has to be accepted for it to be shown to the public. There was a democratic spirit to this exhibition. There was no jury, no prizes, and basically, if you had $6, you could enter your work and you'd be guaranteed for your work to be shown. Even if you were an amateur, right? Even if you were just someone who painted in their spare time or what have you, right? So the idea of this was radical. All these artists who wanted a more open society of creativity, of art making, and they said, submit $6. And of course, $6 in 1917 is very different than $6 today. Nonetheless, it was still more or less affordable to people. that a lot of people could submit works, and there were a lot of works. It was a huge show. And so the very byline of the exhibition was full democracy, full transparency, and allowing everybody who's creative to be shown, right? That was like the central conceptual thrust of this exhibition. So here comes Duchamp, who, remember, he's one of the directors. He's actually in charge of the installation itself, to design the exhibition and the hang. Secretly, under an alias, Armut, he submits a urinal. This is a urinal. It's a ready-made, because he went to the plumbing store and he bought a urinal. He signed it Armut, 1917. He turned it on its side, or on its back, or I don't know how to describe it, but basically, normally a urinal like this would be in a bath, in a toilet, in a restroom. The wall would be here. The plumbing would go into there, and you're basically kind of like looking down. There'd be one of those gross little like sanitizer things in the center. Anyway, let's not go too far down that road. But this would just be like a standard urinal. There are tons and tons made like this in 1917, right? So he's taken one, he's chosen it, he signed it Armut, and he submitted to, he called it Fountain, which, again, there are ways in which calling this Fountain is funny. And he submitted it as Armut. So none of these people knew that Duchamp had done this, right? He used the pseudonym. And so you can imagine what happened, right? There are all these debates between the people who organized this exhibition. Some said, well, we got to show it. Those are the rules, right? This is a purely democratic exhibition. It came with $6, and it's by someone, and so we got to show it. Others said, no, you can't show this. It's obscene. It's gross. It's not art. So on and so forth, right? So eventually it was part of the exhibition, but hidden behind a curtain, and then eventually it was mysteriously lost. So the original is gone. It's lost. This is a very famous photograph of the original by Stieglitz, a very well-known U.S. photographer. Stieglitz took a picture of it before it mysteriously disappeared. So of course a lot of people conjecture and think that like it was destroyed or stolen or whatever it might be. But the object itself had already done what it was supposed to do in some ways for Duchamp. The first thing it did was well, let me just tell you about this part first real quick. Oh, I'm sorry. So it created a whole scandal in the press, and it was being debated, like, is it a work of art? Should we show it? So on and so forth. And it was reproduced in a magazine called The Blind Man, and it was called the Richard Mutt Case. And in this Blind Man, there was a defense of the work itself by someone named Beatrice Wood, who it turns out was a friend of Duchamp's, and really this was probably written by Duchamp himself. So here's Duchamp again. With Duchamp, it's like an onion. You're constantly peeling back layers, and you never quite get to Duchamp himself. Like, he's such a jokester. So it's an article, again, probably written either completely or co-written by Duchamp, defending the work, basically calling out the exhibition, the one he's a part of. They say any artist paying $6 may exhibit. When Armut sent this in, without discussion, it disappeared and was never exhibited. Again, I think it was exhibited briefly behind a curtain, but then it just disappeared. All this is mysterious. And then it goes on. It says the grounds for refusing it was that it's vulgar and immoral. So a lot of people thought, this is vulgar and immoral to show a toilet. And the other one was that this was plagiarism, that this is just a piece of plumbing that the artist Armut, but really Duchamp, didn't make it. So it can't be a work of art. So the rebuttal to this is that the fountain is not immoral. That's absurd. Any more than a bathtub is immoral. It's a fixture that you see every day in plumbers' windows. And he even says the only really, this is like really scathing, especially for U.S. artists, but the only works of art America has given her plumbing and her bridges. So Duchamp is basically saying that the only thing the U.S. is good for is its infrastructure, right, and its technology, not for its arts. And then maybe the most important part, which gets to one of the key definitions of the ready-made, he says it does not matter if the object being used was made by the hands of the artist. What matters is that he chose it. What matters is that he chose it. So above all, if you study Duchamp more, if you go to his subsequent works, you'll realize that Duchamp has a disdain for simple, know-how and skill, right? And this is a historical question, right? Because if you have all these incredible technologies, if you have photography, if you have film, all this stuff, why still paint? Why still study and be able to represent the world in this incredible way? For Duchamp, it's just totally insignificant. You're out of time. You're an anachronistic figure. So for him, what matters in art is, he would always say, gray matter, the concept, the ideas. That's what's important. So the making doesn't matter. Skill doesn't matter. It's the choices and the ideas that matter. So some have really the beginnings of conceptual art in the 60s and 70s, right there with Duchamp in the early 20th century. So really important object. And just the last thing I'll say about Fountain, and one of the many reasons why it's so important. Well, one, it's a type of work that, in a very Duchampian way, hacks the system. It showed that the exhibition could not abide by its own rules. The stakes are kind of low here, right? It's just an exhibition of art. But it gets to a really important logic, even political logic. A lot of people point out that something as big as democracy itself, right? Think of this wonderful political system that we cherish above all others, and rightly so. A democracy, like the people, the demos, setting the rules and holding each other accountable and being sovereign and so on and so forth, right? Democracy is a wonderful thing where it's the people who decide the direction of their country. There are a number of people who point out, yeah, democracy is wonderful, but what happens when the democracy votes to no longer be a democracy? What happens when a democracy votes in a Führer? Or what happens when they vote an authoritarian figure who's going to start tearing up the constitution of that country? What if you have a revolution or a democratically elected figure who will then impose a military regime that's no longer democratic, right? Duchamp is pointing this out. Duchamp is pointing out that the exhibition could not abide by its own rules in a very similar logic, right? A very similar logic, that it in fact couldn't be as generous as it thought it could be. The terrain is completely different, right? The stakes were much lower than the analogy I've just made with democracy, but the logic itself is very similar. But above all, when people talk about Fountain and people talk about the ready-made and this episode, this very famous episode, they'll say that what Duchamp has done is a gesture that's incredibly important and a gesture that had not yet been done in the history of Western art. Everybody, when they're talking about art, would have asked the questions: who made it? Is it beautiful? Where can we place it within the history of art? All these questions, right? Which are important questions, and have been important questions in the history of art history. But what's the most fundamental question that no one has asked? No one has asked this question, which this object is forcing us to ask. And that's the much more basic question. More basic than, is this beautiful? Who made it? What's the style? The most fundamental question is, what is art? Right? What is art? And here we open up a whole can of worms, because if this forces you to question what art is, then the answers are maybe a little uncomfortable, right? The fountain above all shows that the very being of art, what would be called the ontology of art, is something that's not timeless. It's not something that's just handed down to us, or something that sprouted in the Renaissance and then there we have it. We have art, right? No, this gesture by Duchamp, which was like a concrete hacking of an aesthetic system, not unlike the original ready-made, showed that in fact what is considered to be art or not is a vector of power in society. It's institutional. It's the artists who are the directors, whether it's in this show, or curators, or directors of museums. It's a whole institutional and discursive power structure that gets to decide what's in it, what's out, what is art and what is not art. That had never been questioned. With this object, Duchamp basically is saying, well, now we're forced to question it, because this object, this toilet, this urinal, is making people debate whether or not it's a work of art. And this too can get us to larger political categories, right? It seems like we're only talking about art, but this gets to important ideas about all sorts of other things, like not only what is art, but what are the vectors of power in society that decide who's a citizen. You're not just born a citizen, even if you are born a citizen. You are a citizen because there are certain institutional powers and certificates. There's a whole paper trail that reinforcements of power that dictate and that say, yes, you are a citizen. Or if you don't have those papers, then you're not a citizen, right? So there's something about Duchamp's ready-made that somehow opens up to critique and makes visible institutional powers in society. Most obviously, art institutions, but there's a way in which the ready-made also leads to natural questions about other forms of institutional powers that form politics, democracy, citizenship, and society as a whole. So with Duchamp, we can get to even though he's funny, he's often funny and interesting to think about, his works often send us to bigger, more macro, and comparatively more urgent and important ideas. And so this is why the ready-made, and especially the fountain, has been deemed to be one of the most important works in the history of Western art. Okay, so I hope I didn't go overboard. You can tell I'm a fan of Duchamp, and he's a lot of fun to think through and to talk about and to think with. So I hope you found him interesting as well. So until next time, where we talk about surrealism. Ciao.